close your eyes for a moment and step inside. The air in this longhouse isn't just cold, it's heavy, pressed down by months of smoke from the central hearth that can't quite escape through the small hole in the roof. It stings your eyes and leaves a greasy film on everything. The darkness is a physical presence, pushed back only by a weak flickering flame that makes the shadows dance on the mud-caked walls. People huddle on sleeping platforms, wrapped in furs that smell of stale air and unwashed bodies. You're not just breathing atmosphere. You're breathing the recycled breath of your family, your animals, and the slow, creeping dread of a medieval Scandinavian winter that still has weeks left to bite. This isn't temporary discomfort because outside the ground isn't just hard, it's iron. The idea of a living crop is a distant memory from 5 months ago. The weak, watery sun, when it bothers to show its face, hangs low for maybe 4 hours, offering light but no warmth, a useless pale coin in the sky. Your livestock, penned at one end, are thin and restless. Their ribs show, and you've grown accustomed to the hollow sound of their lowing. You feel a deep biological pressure. This isn't a momentary shortage. This is Norse survival in its rawest form. A season of endurance where every mouthful of dried fish and every sliver of smoked meat was calculated months ago. The grain in clay pots, the precious wheels of dairy stored in the cold cellar, the strips of preserved meat hanging from rafters. This isn't just dinner. It's the only wall between survival and a famine risk, so absolute it doesn't even have a name, just a silent, empty feeling in the gut. Rationing grows stricter now, a morsel less for the children, a sacrifice from your own bowl to keep the fire alive in the strongest. The longhouse is no longer a romantic hall of heroes. It's a fragile, biological life support unit, a tiny bubble of heat and ancient food systems trying to outlast a frozen hell. As you stare into the dying embers, you're forced to ask the terrible, silent question everyone fears. Will the stores of preserved food hold longer than winter holds its grip? Or has the cold already won? That question often answered itself not in a single dramatic moment, but in dozens of small, creeping failures that turned the longhouse from a sanctuary into a tomb. The real horror of Norse survival wasn't just the endless dark outside. It was what happened inside the storage pits when nobody was watching. Consider the grain. All autumn, families hauled in barley and rye, carefully drying it before sealing it in wood-lined pits or clay vessels. But one wet autumn could unravel everything. If moisture seeped through the earth, the grain grew hot, sprouting ghostly white shoots that smelled of decay, or worse, it developed a fine, deadly mold that no amount of boiling could render safe. Then came the vermin. Mice and rats gnawed through baskets and leather sacks, their tiny droppings blending with the flour until the entire stock became poison. I've read accounts from medieval Scandinavia describing families opening their pits midwinter, only to find a festering black slop where their future should have been. And that was just the grain. Dried fish and smoked meat carried their own quiet betrayals. If the autumn winds weren't cold enough, or the smoking fire too smoky and not hot enough, fly eggs survived in the flesh. Weeks later, maggots wriggled out of what looked like perfectly edible cod, forcing a starving family to throw the whole rack into the snow. Pests like beetles bored into dried mutton legs. And then there were the two-legged predators. Raiders slipping into outlying storage huts under cover of a blizzard, or a neighboring clan quietly lifting an entire winter's worth of smoked herring while your own people slept. Even wolves sometimes clawed through the weak wood of outdoor caches, leaving nothing but bloody snow and scattered bones. Dairy was just as treacherous. Butter went rancid with a stench so foul it could turn a stomach 20 feet away, and cheese meant to last till spring curdled into a caustic, inedible mass. The psychological weight of these failures fell hardest on the person managing the household stores, usually the wife of the household head. She'd stand in the flickering light of the hearth, counting and recounting the remaining wheels of cheese, the fistfuls of grain, performing a grim calculus of rationing. She knew that a single counting error could doom the youngest child or the oldest grandparent to slip away in their sleep from sheer hunger. Some sagas whisper of families reduced to chewing birch bark, their mouths bleeding, or elders who simply lay down one evening and never rose, sparing the young their share. So as the days grew imperceptibly longer, that silent gamble tightened around every throat. Every morning without green shoots pushing through the ice meant the preserved food had to stretch one more day, and one more day after that, until the line between survival and famine blurred so completely that spring itself felt like a distant myth. That creeping famine risk wasn't met with hope, it was met with a system. Viking winter survival was cold calculation. Every autumn across medieval Scandinavia, each longhouse was a ledger. Grain stores measured in weeks. Dried fish and smoked meat counted by the rack, dairy and livestock, prioritized for slaughter or saving. Rationing wasn't optional. It was the math that kept families alive. This wasn't mythic endurance. It was ancient food systems, coldly executed. If you want to understand survival by planning, not legend, subscribe to Just Viking now. Next, we break down that system step by step. You see, the request for the original material is not merely a procedural nicety. It is a recognition of a profound epistemological tradition that stretches back to the dawn of recorded thought. Every act of commentary, every grand intellectual edifice constructed through exegesis, depends entirely upon the prior existence of a foundational text. In the ancient library of Alexandria, the scholars did not simply conjure knowledge from the void. They gathered the scrolls of Homer, the treatises of Aristotle, and the surgical manuals of Galen from every corner of the Mediterranean. The great commentaries of Aristarchus on the Homeric epics were only possible because the epics themselves were there, inscribed on papyrus, providing the stable anchor for centuries of scholarship. Without the Iliad, there would be no Alexandrian marginalia, no scholia preserving the arguments of long-dead grammarians. The text is the seed crystal dropped into a supersaturated solution of the mind. Only around that specific grain can the elaborate crystalline structure of interpretation grow. This dependency is deeply rooted in the material culture of medieval scriptoria, where monks labored under cold stone vaults to preserve the fragile chain of classical inheritance. A Benedictine copyist, hunched over a manuscript of Boethius, understood that every gloss he added in the margin was an extension of a sacred duty to the original. He was not the author, he was a custodian of a voice that had traveled through time. If the vellum before him had been blank, if the authoritative copy had been lost to fire or damp, his own pen would have stopped in mid-air. No expansion can occur in a vacuum. The entire apparatus of scholasticism, the disputed questions of Aquinas, the distinctions in Peter Lombard's sentences, was an immense logical scaffolding built upon the authority of Scripture and the Church Fathers. Remove the sententiae, the master statements of Augustine or Ambrose, and the whole Summa Theologica dissolves into a silent, empty architecture. The very word text comes from the Latin texere, to weave, and you cannot weave an elaborate tapestry without first gathering the individual threads of the warp. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in the 15th century amplified this reality across an entire continent. The scholarly culture of the Renaissance humanists, from Erasmus to Bude, was a culture of philological reconstruction. They hunted for the purest original source, the ad fontes principle, precisely because they knew that every subsequent elaboration depended on the fidelity of that first utterance. When Politian amended a corrupt passage in the Pandects of Justinian, his brilliant philological expansion was an act of restoration, a clearing away of debris to let the source shine forth. He could not simply improvise a legal expansion in the style of Roman jurisprudence. He needed the concrete lexical evidence embedded in the corrupted manuscript. The entire edifice of modern textual criticism, from Lachmann's Stemmatics to the digital humanities' algorithmic collations, is a monument to the terrifying fragility of the source. A single missing manuscript, a lacuna in the original, can generate a cascade of misinterpretations that ripple through centuries of commentary like a genetic defect. Thus, when I find myself in the position of a commentator without a text, I am placed in a state of pure potentiality that is both intellectually honest and creatively fruitless. It is the condition of the architect presented with an infinite, featureless plane, but no program, no site, no client brief. The magnificence of the Gothic cathedrals did not arise from a spontaneous outpouring of creativity upon a blank landscape. Each vaulted ceiling, each flying buttress was a response to the specific liturgical demands. The acoustic properties of the choir and the sacred geometry dictated by the relics housed within. Chartres Cathedral is an expansion, a three-dimensional sermon in glass and stone. on the foundational text of the Bible and the lives of the saints. To engage in an expansion without the first word is to attempt to build a cathedral dedicated to an unnamed God, using an unstated unit of measurement on a plot of ground that exists only in a dream. The resulting structure, however elaborate, would be a magnificent nothing, a self-referential labyrinth leading nowhere, a hall of mirrors reflecting only the builder's own bewildered face. And so, the silence that precedes the giving of the original material is a pregnant one, heavy with the unspooled histories of all those scholars and artisans who knew that creation is always, at its deepest level, a response. It is the space before the first note of the cantus firmus, waiting for the thematic melody to be stated so that the polyphonic voices of interpretation can begin their intricate dance around it. But in the Viking world, as survival itself had its own rhythm. When the last echoes of the harvest faded, the real music was the hiss of wind through drying racks. For coastal and fjord settlements, fish wasn't just a backup plan. It was the backbone of winter protein, the thing that stood between a family and the hollow ache of famine. Cod, herring, scythe, haddock. These cold water species swarmed the northern seas, and the Norse knew how to turn that fleeting abundance into a food storage miracle that would last for months in the longhouse. They called it stockfish. The process sounds almost too simple, but it demanded perfect conditions. Whole fish were gutted, often beheaded, and hung on massive wooden racks along the shoreline like ghostly forests of fish. Imagine row upon row of pale bodies swaying in the freezing, dry wind. No salt was used. Salt was precious and scarce in medieval Scandinavia, so preservation relied entirely on dehydration. The air had to be cold enough to prevent rot, but dry enough to pull every drop of moisture from the flesh. Over weeks, the fish became hard as wood, stiff enough to knock on. Then it was stacked in dry sheds, a library of preserved food waiting to be drawn upon. Eating it was a ritual. You couldn't bite into a stockfish plank, it would crack your teeth. Pieces were broken off with a mallet or axe, then soaked for hours in water or whey until they softened. Even then, the texture was dense and leathery, eaten like hard tack, often while working or traveling. It was survival food in its purest form, and every mouthful was a small act of household survival. Inland, where rivers cut through forests, the Norse turned to salmon and trout. These were cold smoked, hung in rafters where smouldering fires bathed them in aromatic smoke for days. This method added flavor and extended shelf life, but it carried risks. If the drying season was too wet, the fish would spoil, and remote drying racks became easy targets for theft, a devastating loss when your entire winter food supply hung out in the open. Dried fish wasn't just a supplement to grain and livestock. When red meat ran low, it became the main protein, eaten daily in small rationed bites to stretch the precious stores and keep the shadow of famine at bay. Consider how the dissemination of classical texts, once the guarded treasures of monastic scriptoria, ignited a slow atomic chain reaction across Europe. In the damp, cold workshops of Mainz around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg did not merely assemble metallic letters. He orchestrated a profound democratic upheaval by fusing the wine press's mechanical pressure with the metallurgical precision of the goldsmith. The 42-line Bible that emerged was not simply a sacred object. It was a prototype of intellectual mass production. This technological rupture shattered the medieval monopoly on knowledge maintained by a clergy who controlled the arduous, hand-copied vellum codexes that chained literacy to the altar. By replacing the water-soluble inks of the scribe with a tenacious, oil-based pigment that bit into rag paper, Gutenberg's invention made the word physically immortal, capable of identical replication without the creeping entropy of human error. The profound consequence was a centrifugal explosion of data. Within a single generation, the treatises of the ancient world, Galen's medicine, Euclid's geometry, the atomism of Lucretius, escaped dusty elite libraries and flooded the hands of curious artisans. A miner in Saxony could now hold a vernacular Bible and realize that Matthew's Gospel said nothing of papal indulgences, a cognitive dissonance Luther would weaponize in Wittenberg. The press standardized vernacular grammars, nursing scattered dialects into the national languages that formed the bedrock of the modern nation-state. It trained eyes to scan uniform type, shifting cognition from communal chanting toward the private, heretical scrutiny of the isolated thinker. Without this staccato rhythm of lead letters locking into a chase, The systematic doubt of Descartes would have lacked its social substrate. The meticulously annotated data of Tycho Brahe would have perished in a single fire instead of landing on Kepler's desk. Gutenberg's genius was not a singular craft insight, but the release of intractable truth from the corruptible body into the eternal machined grid of the page, where an idea could finally escape the prison of the present and speak, without degradation, directly across centuries to the future critical mind. But while ideas could be frozen in ink, the Norse family faced a far more urgent challenge: freezing to death if their food ran out. Across medieval Scandinavia, the dairy became a fortress against famine. Cows and sheep were milked right up to autumn's end, but fresh milk vanished in deep winter. The animals went dry or only produced weak milk for sickly calves, so the last precious pails were transformed into a sour lifeline that had to last for months. This was the art of Skyr. It wasn't just yogurt, it was a thick, cultured dairy product, strained until nearly cheese-like, packing a huge calorie punch. They stored it in wooden tubs in the cold longhouse or buried in snow, and it could survive the whole Viking winter. But the real genius was the whey. That acidic byproduct was liquid gold. They used it to preserve meat, submerging joints to stave off rot. They soaked dried fish in it, rendering the hard stock edible, and drank it straight for a tangy dose of energy. Nothing was wasted. Then there was butter, salty and rich, packed into wooden firkins and tucked under wet leaves in cellars. It was so valued, so dense with survival calories, that chiefs took it as tax. Women ran this entire operation. Their intimate knowledge of fermentation and household survival decided if the dairy cache would hold. Imagine the pressure. Watch the pot, gauge the chill, sense when a batch was turning. Their discipline was the difference between spring revival and starvation. Without their ancient food systems, all that preserved food, the hard Skyr cheese scraped into porridge, the lactic stores would fail, leaving grain and rationed livestock as a thin, desperate line against the dark, a gamble few could afford. The very interconnectedness of quantum systems challenges the classical notion of separability, which assumed objects possessed definite properties independent of observation. When John Stuart Bell formulated his inequality in 1964 while working as a particle physics theorist at CERN, his monumental contribution emerged from a deeply philosophical side interest. Troubled by the completeness of quantum mechanics, as articulated by Bohr, he sought a testable criterion to distinguish between local hidden variable theories and the standard Copenhagen interpretation. Bell's insight considered correlations between measurements on two entangled particles widely separated, so no signal traveling at or below light speed could coordinate their outcomes. If nature obeyed local realism, the correlations had to satisfy a mathematical limit. Quantum mechanics, however, predicted violations for certain measurement settings. This transformed a metaphysical dispute into an experimental proposition. The first robust tests were carried out by Alain Aspect in the early 1980s. Using calcium atoms cascading into entangled photon pairs, they rapidly switched polarizer orientations while photons were in flight, closing the locality loophole. Results vindicated quantum mechanics, showing the world is fundamentally non-local. This does not allow superluminal signals. Randomness in individual outcomes prevents information transfer, preserving special relativity. Yet the underlying reality defies independent objects. The Bohmian interpretation offers a hidden variable approach with non-locality, while many worlds avoids collapse but exhibits global entanglement. Profoundly, separability is not fundamental. Spatiotemporal distance becomes irrelevant to correlations that transcend space. This connectedness echoes ancient concepts like Indra's net in Mahayana Buddhism and Leibniz's monads. Modern quantum information science uses entanglement for cryptography, teleportation, and computation. Entanglement also underpins the black hole information paradox, where monogamy and no cloning collide with general relativity, leading to the firewall debate and the search for quantum gravity. The entanglement entropy of a black hole scales with its area, not volume, hinting space-time geometry emerges from entangled microscopic degrees of freedom, as proposed by Ryu and Takayanagi. Thus, from a thought experiment meant to expose quantum mechanics as incomplete, we now realize entanglement might reconcile the two pillars of modern physics. Non-separability challenges our deepest intuitions. suggesting the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and the universe is a unified fabric where every particle communicates through correlations imprinted at the birth of the cosmos. That cosmic web of connection might seem a world away from a frozen Norse longhouse, but in a way the same principle held true inside those timber walls. Every soul huddled there, from the bondy to the lowliest thrall, was bound by the same aching cold and the same dwindling stores. Survival wasn't an individual act. It was one single desperate calculation. And at the center of that calculation sat the husfreyja, the mistress of the house, or sometimes the bondi himself. You could see their authority jingling right at their belt, a heavy iron key ring. Those keys didn't just lock the food storage chests. They symbolized absolute control over who ate, how much, and when. In the depths of a medieval Scandinavian winter, that was the difference between life and a famine risk that could swallow an entire household. The daily rhythm shrank into one focal point, the central hearth fire. Over it hung a great iron pot, and inside was a perpetual stew that never truly emptied. Day after day, the cook pulled out what was needed, then topped it with water, a handful of barley, maybe a few pieces of dried fish soaked until tender. Sometimes, if fortune smiled, a stray bone of smoked meat or a strip of preserved food from the autumn slaughter went in. But mostly, it was a thin, salty broth that stretched a little grain and dried fish into a meal for a dozen people. Flatbread was baked only rarely. Conserving grain was everything. Have you ever tried to function on a bowl of warm, cloudy water with a few fish shavings floating in it? That was the reality of Viking winter survival. Portions were never equal. Freeborn family members received larger shares, enough to keep the heart of the workforce beating. Thralls got the dregs. But even the bondi ate sparingly, leading by example, because every extra spoonful in December meant someone might starve in March. The first to show the cracks were the very young and the very old. The Norse had a phrase, vetra hörka, the winter hardness. Modern storytellers loved to glamorize it as some noble stoic embrace of suffering. But inside that dark longhouse, it wasn't romance. It was grim practical necessity. You endure or you die. There was no third option. Consider the sheer math of rationing. One single dried fish, petrified and salt-crusted, might feed 3 or 4 people for an entire day. It was boiled and boiled again, flaking into the pot until it became more memory than meat. Dairy was strictly allocated too. A small cup of sour whey from the last of the livestock's milk was a lifeline. Only during Joel, the great midwinter feast, did the longhouse exhale. Then slabs of smoked meat appeared, golden grain porridge was ladled thick, and stored wealth was paraded, not just for morale, but as a calculated psychological reset. For a few sacred nights, the future famine risk was forgotten. Then, the very next morning, the husfreyja's keys were back at her belt. The perpetual stew was thinned again, and the iron grip of ancient food systems clamped back down. The universe inside that longhouse was a single fabric, and if one thread broke the fast, the whole thing unraveled. That fragility hung heaviest over the animal stalls. Livestock weren't just meat, they were the seed of the coming year. Lose a pregnant ewe to starvation, and you erased lambs, milk and wool in one blow. So the most critical non-food task of Norse survival was the autumn hay harvest, a race to cut and dry enough grass to store, feed every creature through 5 to 7 months of medieval Scandinavia's cold. Hay was stored in barn lofts or huge outdoor stacks, towering reserves that meant the difference between famine and survival. Feeding strategy was ruthless. Sheep and dry cows made do with coarse, stemmy hay. Pregnant cows and working horses got the precious, greener stuff that still smelled like June. In coastal pockets, animals chewed dried seaweed and birch twigs. But that was barely better than hunger. Temperature mattered. A frozen cow couldn't calve, couldn't give milk, so farmers brought beasts right into the longhouse, into the skemmer, sharing body heat through the Viking winter. It smelled like a barn, but that communal warmth kept everyone alive. Some farms built stone shelters butted against the house, an architectural hug. Then came the ugly math of rationing. If the haystack shrank too fast, families culled early, before an animal starved into useless bone and sinew. They'd slaughter while there was still fat, preserving the flesh into smoked meat, even though it meant fewer breeding stock next year. That gamble gnawed at you. Calving and lambing were timed for the first green shoots the moment winter cracked open. But if the cold dragged on, newborns dropped into frozen slush and died. No milk, no dairy. No household survival at all. One snapped thread, and the whole ancient food system unraveled, and that unraveling could happen terrifyingly fast when winter simply refused to let go. The calendar inside the longhouse might say it was time for thaw, but outside the wind still cut like a knife, and the snow showed no signs of shrinking back. This was the moment every Norse household dreaded, the late winter emergency, when stored food was nearly gone and spring broke its promise. You'd see the signs building slowly at first, and then all at once. The hayloft was nothing but dust and trampled chaff. The grain pit under the floorboards scraped empty. The last few dried fish hung so high in the rafters that you could count them with a single glance, and the smoked meat had shrunk to a handful of leathery strips reserved for the smallest children. Livestock stood on trembling legs, too weak to low, their ribs pushing through winter-thin coats. In the dim light of the longhouse, parents stopped eating at midday, cutting their own rations down to nothing, so a son or daughter could have one more mouthful. That quiet sacrifice was the first alarm bell of famine risk in medieval Scandinavia. When the normal preserved food ran out, people turned to things barely food at all. They stripped inner bark from birch and pine, drying and grinding it into a gritty, bitter flour. They scraped lichen from rocks, boiled old leather belts and shoes to soften them into a grim jelly, and tapped blood from living animals, mixing it with water to stretch a little iron into the body. In extreme cases, horse meat was eaten, though in many regions that was taboo, unless the alternative was watching your household collapse. Some families had one more trick: hidden caches. Evidence suggests a shrewd farm wife might have buried a sealed crock of grain or roots under a tree back in autumn, a secret stash so precious that not even the thralls knew where it lay. When you dug down through the moss, the cold soil had kept turnips and wild carrots firm for months. But what happened when even the hidden cache ran dry? You faced desperate options. Maybe you sent a party on skis into the mountains, hunting for stray reindeer that survived the deep snow, returning either with meat or not at all. Perhaps in the darkest hour, you eyed a neighbor's storehouse and thought the unthinkable. Raiding wasn't only for foreign shores. Or you simply sat in the dark longhouse and felt hunger gnawing at your household. The sagas don't shy away from these moments. In Landnámabók and other old texts, you find lean winters where even chieftains stepped forward to redistribute grain, breaking open their own pits to prevent mass starvation. That was the final safety net. Not stored food, but community. Then, one morning, you'd hear it. A drip, a trickle of meltwater. The ice on the fjord cracked with a sound like timber splitting, and there, pushing through the slush, the first impossible green shoots. The survival calculation reset, and everyone still breathing could start gathering. Not just rationing, but that first green shoot wasn't luck. It capped a brutal winter of Norse survival built on relentless planning, not just grit. Every dried fish, cut of smoked meat, and spoonful of skyr from the dairy, all counted in a brutal math of food storage. Inside the longhouse, medieval Scandinavia's true fortress, famine risk lived in every choice. Grain and hay for livestock had to stretch precisely. Rationing was never generous. It was a survival calculation where one wrong number meant starvation. This isn't distant history. It's a mirror to human limits, the sharp knowledge ancient food systems demanded. Winter survival wasn't about heroics. It was household discipline, honed over centuries. For more deep dives into the real systems behind Viking life, subscribe to Just Viking and turn on notifications. We bring you the untold survival stories that history forgot. I'm Nolan, and this is Just Viking.